Hey there, I'm Scott, and this is Tangents. Well, last week I recorded one of these, I think on the 5th, and had some technical issues, and also have been really busy. Didn't have a chance to edit it and put it up, but got a text from Gil this morning, kind of like, hey, where the fuck is the thing? So I put last week's up. The audio quality on that one sucks. This one should be better. I've tested it like 5 times. It should be working. Why did it not work last time? I don't know. It's happened a couple of times. What the fuck? I don't even know. I do everything the same way. Go through the same checks. I mean, to be fair, I don't actually have headphones on. I'm in the other room from the computer. But, this is not that complicated of a system. It is a radio antenna, so maybe that's not functioning properly. But seems fine. So anyway, hopefully this one will work for you. So today is the 12th of November 2020. Biden has not yet quite officially won, but probably has. Disturbingly, and maybe this won't be so disturbing to you when you're looking back at this, but disturbingly, Trump and a good fraction of the Republican Party basically think the election is illegitimate, and it's just like a complete fucking insane shithouse. It just, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you recover from a situation like this. Literally, 70% of Republicans don't think that the election of 2020 was free and fair. And even if you convince them that it was, 71 million people voted for this motherfucker. 71 million Americans. You look at the population, which is currently, I think, 330-ish million. 70 is not an insignificant fraction of that. It's now, granted, more voted for Biden, as shitty as he is, but he's, again, I think worlds better than Trump. And in fact, I think the only way you can argue that it's better, like, I know people who argue they're both equally bad. I know people who argue Trump is actually better. The only way that you can make that kind of argument, in my opinion, is basically that Biden sort of fucks things up more in the long run, and that people will push back against Trump, and then you end up having more of a revolution. The sort of Susan Sarandon, Trump would bring the revolution thing from 2016. She was for Biden this time, by the way, but this is not a good situation. So maybe all of this will blow over and not be a big deal, but who the fuck knows? I don't. What I wanted to talk about today, and actually I had, looking down at my note cards, you can't see on the floor, but there are a few there. I had a few things that I wanted to talk about, and then something kind of came up today, and I thought of a different topic. This almost always happens. But topic is money. And money is an interesting thing, to me at least, because it's something that for a very large chunk of my life, I basically didn't think about. And yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, there were times, especially after my parents got divorced, my mom was an attorney, but during law school, she had trouble, with money. She wasn't super flush with it. Various times, it was a struggle when I was a kid. And it was always, we were kind of okay, but basically not. Incidentally, it is almost 9 o'clock. I don't know if you can hear the ridiculous motor noise outside. Almost 9 o'clock, and it sounds like there's a fucking motorbike rally outside. Probably one of the assholes with a big fucking Trump flags, but never mind that now. Anyway, we had, you know, money issues. Definitely was never quite to the point where, you know, we were going hungry, but there were times where it was like precarious, you know. And I think to some extent that made me sensitive to it in the sense that, yeah, I think part of this is also, I at least like to think of myself as fairly empathetic. And even though I've never been, like, I've never worked as a waiter, I've never been a barista, any of this stuff. It's a weird word because it sounds feminine, but it seems to refer to both. But anyway, I've never been in that kind of a position. I've never, you know, worked for tips. But I feel like just being a halfway decent person, you should recognize that people who work for tips kind of need the tips, especially given that they don't make very much money without them. And so you kind of learn about that and you're like, ugh, you know, fuck this. Don't go cheap on the tips. You can fuck over somebody's night. I mean, think about how fucked up it is actually that we just have this standard where if you work as a waiter, and I'm using that asexually, but waiter, waitress, whatever. If you work as a waiter, then depending on chance, basically, you could put in the same amount of effort, the same amount of time, and what you make can fluctuate wildly. Now, you know, your hourly rate is not fixed. I mean, you have an official hourly rate, but the amount that you make is extremely volatile and unreliable. This is fucking insane. So for that reason, despite never having worked in that kind of job, I try to tip reasonably well. Now, probably not like extravagantly, but like 20-30% has been my kind of ballpark for as long as I've been able to tip. Basically since I was, you know, probably a teenager. And yeah, sometimes much more extravagant. There was one time in my life where I left a truly, truly shitty tip. 1 penny. And I would not generally do this. I probably, in retrospect, even given the circumstances, I might not do it again. But my mom, my sister, her best friend, some other people, and I were at this restaurant we go to, or used to go to all the time, you know, in normal times. We were at this restaurant, and the waiter that we had just, I'm not saying he sucked, but I mean, he sucked beyond, you know, what a normal waiter would do, and beyond anything that I've experienced any other time. This guy basically, like, kind of showed up to take our order, very long delay, gets us our food, and then basically just checked out. And I noticed all the other tables that he was going to quite regularly. Mostly, I always kind of suspect this. We're not exactly like teetotalers, but nobody at the table was drinking. Drinks tend to be much more expensive. And, you know, I think people often get better attention when they're burning more money, because tips are based on percentage of what you're spending, which is another fucked up weird thing. You know, so if I don't get alcohol, my 30% tip might be less than somebody's 10% tip if they get a bunch of beers. And, you know, so that's it's not the way things should be. Obviously, you should just have an hourly rate, or, you know, I'm going to get to more about money in a minute, but, you know, he kind of checked out in a very serious way. And it wasn't just like he was slammed, it was just like, you know, and it was a ridiculous amount of time. It was like, yeah, I'm trying not to exaggerate, but like 30-45 minutes trying to get his attention. Couldn't do it. Finally had to get somebody else to do this stuff. And it was very irritating. Left a 1 cent tip. Again, you know, I was younger. I don't know that I would do that again. If I, in fact, I think in the same circumstance, I'd probably still, I'd probably give him like a 15% tip, not be happy about it, but I understand. This was before I learned how little waiters make. Um, Absent tips, it's, you talk to somebody who works as like a bartender or a waiter, and it's like, holy shit, there was a waitress that I very often in my life have become kind of like a regular someplace. And I remember the first time, I'm at a restaurant I'd go to pretty much every week, and knew the waitress. It's kind of, a regular. And she and I were talking, and then she explained how their pay works. And it's so wrong that if you've not experienced it and you don't realize that it's the way it is, it just doesn't even seem possible, if you know what I mean. So, you talk to her and you're like, holy shit, they basically they make a couple bucks an hour, which the way that it's calculated basically zeroes out after they pay tax. It's basically enough to cover their taxes. So they're essentially working for free plus tips. I'm slightly exaggerating, but not that much. It's crazy. And this is just normal here. This is something that people just, that's just the way it is. There are so many things like this that, like seeing somebody on the street. Depending on, okay, you could argue details about this. You could make a point like, oh, well, Scott, you're kind of exaggerating here. But I would say, by a reasonable measure, we are, the United States, the wealthiest nation in history. Again, you could make an argument, but I think it's a true statement. When you look at other countries, which are very well-to-do, like say Switzerland, and you look at the median income, and you look at the mean income, and the difference is striking. So in Switzerland, and I don't have the numbers to hand, so I'm probably off by a bit, but in Switzerland, if memory serves, the mean income is something like 400, 500K. Yeah, it's a decent amount. Mean, of course, is the arithmetic mean, which means if you have, a lot of people down here and you have one person way the fuck out here, arithmetic mean kind of is the center of mass of all of those, so to speak. The median is the point where if you cut it, half the population is above, half the population is below. So in a place where there's very great inequity, the mean can be quite high, but the median will be very low. And you look at these things. In Switzerland, the median income is actually into the hundreds of dollars per year. Shockingly decent amount. And it's not that far from their mean. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's not like they're the same. There's definitely some very wealthy people there. But it's not, and I'm not holding Switzerland up as like some great example. I'm just using that as another kind of typical wealthy nation. Not wealthy in terms of total amounts, obviously. You have to kind of, well, do you mean per capita wealth, or do you mean, it's complicated. Do you mean gross domestic product? Do you mean the wealth per, for the population? What do you mean? Pick a definition. The United States, the mean, again, is four-ish, or ballpark, same kind of area, 100K. And the median is for a family like 60K. And you can look at wealth, or you can look at income, or anything like this. And the disparity is great. And it is something where, should not be this great. The mean also means that if you took all the wealth, put it in the same pot, divided it out by everybody would have the mean amount. Now, I'm not suggesting that's a good thing to do. I know people who think that it would be. I'm a much bigger, and this will get into the money thing. I still haven't even started talking about that really. This is the problem with this whole premise because you know, even if I have a thesis and something I want to get to, I go off on tangents. But you know, it's just striking that we have so much wealth in this country, and yet we have poor people. Yeah, now they're not quite like extreme poverty on the global scale. They're not people who, like, there are people in the world who have no water, no sanitation, things that are just basic, you know, almost givens for most of this country. Now, it is important to note there are people here that really do live in kind of extreme poverty, but still, you have some resources. You have a country that is not terrible. There are places in the world where, you know, like, extreme poverty is at another level. But that being said, we have poverty here that is at a level that I just don't think, I mean, you know, you get used to it, I guess, but if you came from a more civilized civilization, if you came from a place where nobody was poor and nobody was living on the street and nobody was begging for money or food, you come here and you're like, what the fuck are you people doing? Like, what is going on here? And you could almost excuse it or understand it if we were a poor nation. I mean, that's the thing. But we're not. We have so much, and yet there are people who are completely fucked, and not even just people who have like a kid that gets sick or who get in a crash and they have, you know, like massive medical expenses that bankrupt them. But which is a horrible thing that also shouldn't exist here. Doesn't exist anywhere else in the world pretty much. And you look at other developed, like our peer nations, it's not a thing. It's like we stand out in a very bad way. But you look at the poverty here and it just is ridiculous, and you just can't fucking believe it. And I mean, another thing that I think, like, if you came from a place, imagine you came from a world where, and to be fair here, part of this is a matter of resources and technology, but you come from a world where you can have pretty much any food at all, and it doesn't involve murdering animals or torturing them. So you could have something that was essentially meat, but nobody died for you to have that meat. Nobody suffered for you to have that meat. And then you come here and you see, oh, they have sentient animals with brains that are not all that different from ours, experiencing horrible traumatic events and sitting there being cultivated to be culled for us to eat. It's beyond grotesque, and it's one of these things again where, like, if you looked at it from that perspective, like it's almost like it fucks your mind. It's like, how is this a thing? What fucking barbarians we are, truly. But then you do have to recognize that if you have essentially a replicator, or you have the technology to make meat that is indistinguishable from meat. Like, you know, the Impossible Burger is very good. It is an approximation of a hamburger that I would say passes for meat. If you've not tried one, incidentally, try it. But it's not like the most delicious burger you've ever had. You know, I'm not a huge burger guy, but Impossible Burger, if you've never tried one, even if you have tried one, if I gave you an Impossible Burger, I don't know that you would know definitively that it wasn't meat. Now, you might say, well, that's not the best hamburger I've ever had, but you'd think it was a hamburger. Unless, I mean, obviously, if I set it up so that you know, then you know. But absent that, it's pretty good. But if you had the technology to make like the best possible version of any kind of meat that you might like, and it is essentially meat, and by any meat, you know, like, you literally could not tell. and you're coming and you're looking at a civilization that doesn't have that technology, I guess you can kind of say that, it's not quite fair to judge them, but it's still like, I mean, it's disgusting and like, holy shit, and immoral and unethical. I would think at the very least, just as a matter of ethics, you try not to have, suffering, or at least to minimize it. And you try to, I when I go flying, there's a factory farm, which is just dense with cows. And you go there and, or go by there, it's the stench of death. And like, it almost smells like formalin or formaldehyde, I don't know. And it just like cadaverine and, like literally smells like death. These are animals that are seeing, like basically no green. They're just like living in this dense situation. They're not like happy cows on little rolling hills in Oregon. They're packed together in like a little corral. And they're basically just machines to grow, make meat, and then be killed, and then eaten. It's just like, I don't know. I find it I don't find it particularly defensible, even given the technology that we have now. Even given that, like people want meat. Okay, well, we have plenty of land, and I understand it's labor intensive, and it takes land, it's expensive, all this stuff. You work out the difference in cost, it's not that much. And it's one of these things, like, we are not a poor nation. We have the resources to do this. And similarly, we have the resources to feed and house everyone. We have the resources to take care of everybody, to make sure that everybody has medical care. Everybody has, like, not just an education, but like a world-class, fucking good education. And we instead choose to give people, like in-state tuition at Arizona State, it ends up being like $36,000-ish a year. I mean, in this one, in the state constitution of Arizona, there's actually a thing. I think it's like shit. I had it in my mind. I looked it up earlier for something else. Article something, section 6, article 3, I don't know. Whatever it is, article 2. There's this thing in the Arizona State Constitution. I will have to look it up later. I apologize for not knowing the number now. But, although I think it's section 6 of whatever it is. Either way, it says that higher education should be as close to free as possible. Basically, not discriminate. It's crazy because this is in the Arizona State Constitution, which is not a place that seems, like a place that would have this. And it's been there for a long time. It's not like they just added it yesterday. And it says higher education should be open freely to men and women, not on a basis of sex or anything like this, and as nearly free as possible. Which to me means, like maybe it's not free, which would be nice, but some fee that is so low that anyone, even the poorest person in the state, could cover it. And incidentally, I mean, also the poorest person in the state shouldn't be and needn't be homeless or, like unable to meet basic needs. We have the resources, just fucking, that kills me. So the reason that I wanted to talk about money, sidetrack aside, is I find it a very bizarre concept. And it's not even that I find it a bizarre concept. Obviously, you have the whole idea of sort of economics where you have some kind of resource that's scarce, and then you have more people that want that resource, and so you have some kind of trade for it. That makes sense. That's kind of like a almost law of nature. It's almost like just energy balance, And in fact, I do think ultimately, at some point in the not too distant future, money will essentially be replaced by energy. I don't mean that, like currency will be energy necessarily, but the idea of, like, if you imagine that you have some kind of automation where any kind of labor, any kind of physical labor is basically reduced to, like, your automation is so good, you have robots or whatever that are so good that anything you want to build, if you have enough energy to put it in, you basically have it done. It is a done fucking deal. Now, that means that essentially everything gets reduced to the raw materials that go into it and energy. And once you have that level of technology, raw materials, I mean, even when you look like around sort of, our star system, we don't have like ridiculous amounts by sort of universal cosmic scale stuff, but we have so much, just, like a single nickel iron asteroid at today's prices, obviously would put it on the market, changes things a little bit, but typical one, and nothing too special, is like trillions of dollars, like literally get into the kind of scale of the entire world, economy. And that is one thing in terms of like how much iron there is. And you kind of look at that or gold, like there's so much gold just sitting up there that, I mean, there's even more gold here, by the way. It's just not that accessible. It's almost kind of weird. Is it easier to dig down and pull it out from, the mantle or our core, wherever you're going to get your metals, or is it easier to build a rocket, go up into space and mine asteroids and then return it, or probably use it up there, because like why, other than putting industry up there where pollution isn't as big of a deal as it is down here, you're not like polluting our own ecosphere. There's not a lot of reason to do stuff up there and bring it down relative to just build fucking shit up there and use it up there. But if you wanted to build like massive space stations, the size of states, the size of like Rhode Island, there's plenty of material up there. And if you had that kind of automation, it's basically energy. And if you need energy and you're up in fucking space, you have a big ball of thermonuclear fusion that's just radiating it away for free into the universe. So much so that, like a second of what's coming off of that star is more than we're using in like the history of, I don't know if it's the history of civilization or a year. I should know these numbers. I should look stuff up like that, but I didn't have it to hand. But it's a ridiculous amount. Obviously, hopefully, you're getting if I'm talking about something like that, maybe look it up. And when I say maybe look it up, I don't mean that I should. I mean, if you're watching, look that shit up. And then find something else that you go from there, and so on and so on. Maybe don't quite do that to the extent of my friend Adam, who I went to grad school with. And actually, I guess there were two Adams, but one of the two Adams, one of them was like a casual acquaintance. The other one was pretty friendly. And this Adam, he was kind of a weird thing. In grad school, we both had RA ships, which meant we got paid technically for like 20 hours a week of work. Not a lot of money, like 20K or something. And then you work. I was kind of lazy for a grad student, and I probably worked like 45, 50 hours a week. Adam was like, I don't know. I mean, he had social life. He did things, but he was in the office like crazy lengths of time. He must have been, I'm not saying he necessarily was working like 80 hours a week, but he was in there like that much. And this guy, like, he'd go off on these jaunts through Wikipedia, like a Wikipedia hole, and he'd just start, like get on some subject and then just go to the greatest extent of where he could get. I remember like, and it would always be on some weird topic. Like one of them was he started, I don't know how he got into it, but he started talking about marathons and the original marathon race, and then got into ultra marathons, who at the time I didn't know anyone who did that thing, or that kind of thing. I thought it was a crazy fucking thing, like running 100 miles or something of the sort. I know someone since then who I used to climb with, who actually does that kind of shit. This is a guy who, John, like you know John, obviously no, but my friend John, he will just like, go off and run and do 26 miles. And it's just like I'm just gonna run for a little while kind of thing. Like you might run a 5K just to run. He'll just run like in a marathon and like, no big deal. And then he goes and does these like ultra marathons and something called man versus horse and like weird, crazy shit that just does not even seem possible. He does this. And it's funny because Adam was telling me one day about ultra marathoners. I heard this and I was just like, it doesn't even sound like a real thing. Another day, Adam somehow got into penises. I don't mean he was like into penises, but somehow his topics went into this area. And then he starts telling me about like cetaceans have a prehensile penis, which kind of makes sense in a weird way after you think about it. Because, I mean, first off, you learn that cetaceans are mammals, which means they have breasts, or at least they produce milk. Not exactly breasts like humans. And then you're like, whoa, where? And you realize, oh, they have slits. Yeah, little fun fact. But you're in the water, it's pretty hard to do some humping. So they have the ability to kind of navigate, so to speak. He told me, he'd go into these holes and then we'd talk for like a half hour and he'd kind of give me the condensed version. Ducks have like an exploding corkscrew penis. It's corkscrewed. The female duck corkscrewed the other way as a weird evolutionary kind of arms race. And ducks will have this thing where like the male duck is like flying, female duck's just like chilling out. Male duck flies down and then like, and like duck rape with an exploding penis. Like evolution is weird. That's all I'm saying. I don't even know how I got onto that topic, but the money thing. Money as sort of a currency at one point in time really did kind of, at one point in time you start out, people just do work or they collect things and that's it. I want that nut, there's a nut. I want a tree branch for whatever, I got a tree branch. Make it into something, whatever. Then they start bartering. I have a bunch of nuts, you have a bunch of tree branches, let's make a deal. And then you start weird, like, well, I have nuts, you have tree branches, but I don't really want a tree branch. I want those stones that dude has. But he doesn't want, and you're like, well, okay, am I gonna barter this and then barter that and then do some kind of weird exchange? Well, no, you kind of come up with some kind of currency. So it's, you kind of step slowly further and further from a direct connection with material things that actually have inherent value. And where we are today, we have like a fiat currency, basically no real connection to any value at all. It's just kind of, it is what we think it's worth, and that's it. And so it's kind of weird when you think about like what even is money today. And I don't want to get into things like modern monetary theory. Let's just say I have thoughts about that. Not a topic I want to get into, and it's also not something I'm an expert enough on to really talk about, but it's just problematic. Let's just say that. But it's not totally wrong in the sense that money is kind of a work of fiction, and it has, the only reason it means anything is that we all agree that it means something. It's kind of an interesting thing how much of what we consider normal is just a construct based on sort of a collective delusion of, like, well, we all think this, so it basically, at least to first approximation, is the case. It's sort of weird. We all think these are the rules, and so they're the rules until somebody decides, well, I'm going to try something else. And, oh shit, there was nothing holding us to those rules. So, I don't really want to get too deep into this, but it's something that you think a lot, or I think a lot about, especially given, like, when I was younger, even though we had some moments where it was kind of a stretch, I didn't think that much about money. And I, in fact, kind of thought it was a virtue not to think about money. And I've realized since then, and maybe it's partly just because I went through some hard times while I was trying to kind of get my business going. I'm still trying to get my business going, but it's kind of, at least now, I think we have 5 full-time employees. We have kind of like, it's kind of weird. We're like actually functioning as a business. Started out as a thing where it was just kind of, like me obstinately not wanting to work at ASU or something like this, and I'm kind of just off on my own, struggling. And when you struggle like that for a while, you start running into some things, and you start realizing, oh well, money, as much as I don't want to think about it, and as much as from the perspective of someone who is, has the technology where essentially energy is everything, and there's so much energy around that, I mean, it's not that everything is free, but little things like food and water and shelter are effectively free. If you want to start making like a starship and, like travel to even a distant planet, let alone another star system, that starts becoming a material amount. But when you're talking about like little things, like the things that people use in their day-to-day lives, it's so little material, so little energy relative to, say, just the sun's budget. It's like, doesn't even, it's almost to the point where, I mean, if you think about it in terms of money, I have this much money and I can get all the basic needs taken care of with something that is so inconsequential that, it's not even a rounding error. Like a rounding error would be bigger than this. And I'm not saying that we're there, not quite there, but we're also really like almost all scarcity that we encounter in our everyday lives. Certainly the scarcity of healthcare, the scarcity that puts people on the street, the scarcity where people go bankrupt, almost all of these things, the scarcity where people die of fucking starvation. That scarcity is a fiction. It does not exist anymore. It's kind of crazy when you think about it, because like millions of kids die of starvation every year. That's totally unnecessary. Like, it is purely people's almost willful decision to hoard shit. And the thing is, it's not just that you're hoarding shit because you're like, oh, I need this. You have people hoarding stuff, and it's so much stuff that they have that you can't even conceive of the amount. It's like, in your lifetime, if you are extravagant, you couldn't even scratch the surface of how much some people are hoarding. And yet, they do. And because they do, we have extreme poverty still. We should be, again, we're not quite a post-scarcity or post-discontent society, but we're not there. You know, we're someplace, we are to the point where certainly everybody's basic needs on the Maslow hierarchy, food, shelter, water, material needs, all that stuff in the bottom could totally cover it. And we don't. It is a willful, absolutely just conscious choice not to do it. Now, that's not to say that all suffering is a choice. You know, like people get sick. There are things that you just, like, even with the most advanced technology we have, you can't do fucking shit about. They suck. But stress about money is something that does not need to exist. Now, if you want to stress about money in the sense that you're like, oh, well, I want to build a $1 billion factory. Okay, have some stress about that. That's something that's like a reasonable, you know, you're starting to get into like material amounts of stuff. But when you're talking about stress about like, can you pay your $50 bill at the end of the month? Or can you pay a couple $100 in bills at the end of the month? Or your rent or whatever? It's not something that you're choosing to do exactly, but it's not something that needs to be that way. I mean, you think about it, this pandemic really puts this into stark focus and contrast that people can kind of work from home, and almost all of the things that people are really suffering because of, the economic things, like not being able to pay rent, okay, I can work from home. If you're a waiter or waitress, can't work from home. You're kind of fucked. The reason that you can't pay rent is because, or one of the reasons, or that you're forced to work under these circumstances, is that we gave like $1.5 trillion away to wealthy people, for the most part, and kind of left you out in the cold with a one-time check of, what, $1,200? Maybe if you were lucky. If you take that 1.5 trillion and you divide it by 330 million, you know, and you go like, okay, what's a couple 100,000, and that's for every man, woman, and child. A couple hundred, or, you know, what is it, like 2,000 per month for a few months, equivalent. Yeah, and then you think, well, rent, okay, probably don't want to just pause rent by itself, because there are people, I have friends who have a house and they're renting it, and they can't just not take rent because they're paying their mortgage with the rent. Now, rent seeking you can have different thoughts about, but if you're in that position and you have a mortgage and you don't get rent, you're in a deep, you know, in the way things are now, you're in trouble. But you could pause the mortgage. There's no reason for the bank not to just say, okay, pause. Or, you know, banks wouldn't do that, obviously, because they're fucking greedy bastards, but governments could say, you know, banks, pause everything. And then because the banks have paused everything, landlords pause the rent. And by the way, here's, you know, non-means tested $2,000 per month for, you know, pretty much everybody. And you sort of like think about this and you're like, oh, everyone who is getting evicted now, everyone who is starving or, you know, struggling, like, it is a choice. And I don't mean it's your choice, but I mean it is a choice of society to make things this way. It is an absolute conscious decision to leave people in these kinds of positions. And so, I mean, I guess that's the gist of what I wanted to talk about. Yeah, and you think, or I think anyway, a lot about kind of where we are. There was a time, mind you, where like the Depression, legitimate struggle, like there were not that many resources. Although even then, what's crazy is that there were programs in the Depression, which actually seem like they might be a good idea now, but basically like, I can't remember the name of this one, but there was one where they basically built national parks and did all kinds of infrastructure, had basic, you know, like camps essentially, and poor people could get into these things. They'd get paid a decent stipend. They'd have, you know, nice meals. Not like extravagant meals, but adequate meals. And not just adequate, like, like it's okay. But, like actually this is a decent meal. And, work and not just busy work, but actually doing like real work that made impacts that we still feel today. This kind of fizzled out eventually, but it's a thing people did. And people had much less, when you look at productivity and the total amount of resources that people had access to at the time, was not as prosperous of a time as it is now. And yet at this time, we have that kind of disparity of rich and poor, but we don't have anybody like really pushing the bottom up, which is, it's just tragic. And again, it doesn't need to be this way. So anyway, with that, thank you very much for watching or listening. I will be back next week. Say Jim.